In 1978, a Texan-born man went on national TV, competing in and ultimately winning an episode of the popular American game show The Dating Game. This man was a successful photographer who you might find skydiving or motorcycling, according to his introduction on that show. Left out of that description though, unknown to the show's producers and the millions watching at home, was a terrifying secret. That this man, Rodney Alcala, was a rapist and a murderer who would eventually be sentenced to life in prison. He died in 2021, leaving behind a terrible legacy of unthinkable violence. He was conclusively linked to 8 murders, with the true number of his victims thought to be closer to 130. This week on Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows, I'm joined by Ian McDonald, the screenwriter behind Woman of the Hour, a new thriller telling the tale of Alcala's dating game appearance. Other storytellers might have approached this real-life story determined to answer one question. What exactly possessed a man who's meant to be lying low, evading the law, to parade himself in front of the nation for all to see in the middle of a killing spree? Ian and the film's director and star, Anna Kendrick, however, had a different question that they wanted to get to the bottom of. Never mind the motivations of this cowardly abuser, how was his killing spree enabled by a broader culture of misogyny, a culture that the game show itself and our current media is kind of implicated in? To answer that question, the film centers not on Alcala, but on Cheryl Bradshaw, a real-life contestant on that episode of The Dating Game, played by Kendrick. In the spoiler conversation that you're about to hear, you'll discover why that is, what the film's evocative title means to Ian, and what it is about society that seems to reward misogynists, both then in the 1970s and today, perhaps more than ever. We get into what the film has in common with Longlegs, the brilliant Oz Perkins horror, and break down what's fact and what's fiction in this brilliant film. Ian was a fantastic guest, a massive thank you to him for coming on the show, and a big thank you as ever to our Patreon supporters, without whom this show would not be possible. If you'd like to join that community, if you'd like to get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, the chance to ask your questions, and the opportunity to join our weekly writing hour, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart and signing up for the price of a monthly cup of coffee. That address one more time in case you're interested, it's patreon.com/scriptapart. Okay, with that all out the way, we can dive straight in. This is the very insightful Ian McDonald on the first draft secrets of Woman of the Hour. Thanks everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, and produced by Camille Demek. Ian, welcome to the show. Congratulations on Woman of the Hour, which I found to be so gripping. The kind of true life tale behind this film, Ian, I was not familiar with going in. Like the idea of this serial killer who went on a primetime game show mid-murder spree. I suppose we should begin there. How did the story first land on your radar? Because, as I say, it wasn't something familiar to me. And what about it struck so violent a chord in you, Ian? Because I think you can really feel the power of your astonishment at the true life story and the power of Anna's astonishment in the way that this film is written and in the way it's directed.
Well, the truth is, it started with Rodney, and I think I read about him on some list of serial killers online, and the whole like serial killer on the dating game thing, like that's interesting, but it's not really enough to make you want to dedicate 6 months or a year or 7 years, as it turned out, of your life to a project. And so it wasn't until I started diving into his story more and doing the research that I kind of found my way into it. And the thing that I found interesting about him was in true crime circles, I think Rodney Alcala is frequently compared to someone like Ted Bundy. And what I think people mean by that when they say it is just, he was handsome and he was well educated and he was kind of charismatic. But in actuality, they were very different people because Ted Bundy was very good at hiding who he was. He was sort of a chameleon, both physically and personality wise. And Rodney Alcala really flaunted who he was. Whenever you hear about people who are just like, oh my God, no, it couldn't have been that guy, they're shocked that so and so is accused of this. Like that was never Rodney. Everyone's just like, yeah, that kind of checks out. He was sort of a creep. He wore his bad behavior on his sleeve, not the killing so much, but like, he would schlep around this photo album filled with pictures of naked underage kids. And so no one was super surprised. But the thing that tells you is that like what the story then becomes about is less him and it's more everybody around him that like looked the other way, and how that kind of enabling of little to moderate bad behavior allowed him to also get away with much worse behavior. And so like thematically, I found that really interesting, and it felt substantive enough where I could spend months or years exploring that. In terms of Cheryl, honestly, a lot of Cheryl's narrative is fictionalized, and that was deliberate. I made some efforts in the early stages of this to find her and to hunt her down, and the issue is that in all of the Alcala related documents that I could find, whether it's like an LA Weekly article or a Dateline episode or something, she was never part of any of that. And so my takeaway was like, this is a woman who doesn't want her life to be defined by like a half-hour encounter with a psychopath. And so, I try to respect that and kind of not pull her into the mix. And so her narrative was largely fictionalized while using certain key elements that I was able to find from both the dating game episode, and also it seems like she left California at some point after the show. And so little things like that were jumping off points for creating the character.
You touched on something there that I think chimes with what I found most impressive about the film, maybe, which is, Woman of the Hour. It's not just another serial killer story. It's not another true crime tale of some malicious murder rampage. The film kind of contextualizes the killer's crimes as like an extreme version of behaviors that are already pervading society. So Cheryl is subjected to these unwanted advances and these acts of coercion and these attempts at control in the film long before she encounters Rodney, right? So the game show seems to be this nexus point for all these weird micro-misogynies that you might make the argument lead to a person like Rodney being able to exist and do what he does. So yeah, Ian, can you talk to me about like the already threatening world that Cheryl occupies in this film before Rodney enters the mix, and the connective tissue between the game show and Rodney himself? Because there seems to be a suggestion within the film that they're part of the same system somehow.
Yeah. No, that's something that I knew I wanted the film to be about from the get-go, which is, I don't want it to be a film about a serial killer, because serial killers, I think, as people, aren't really interesting. Because what they do is so dark. I think we tend to assume that they're these oceans, and in fact, they're puddles. They don't run very deep. What they want is actually pretty simple. But the thing that is complicated and is interesting to me is the kind of spectrum of misogyny, which it's funny, it is the spectrum of misogyny, but at the same time, I do think it's important to flag that Rodney had male victims. Like he appears to be one of the few bisexual killers, and so there's like a male victim in this, which is kind of hinted at and gestured at more than it's made explicit. But I find that really interesting. But regardless, I think the spectrum is what's interesting because it contains so much. It contains Rodney, who is like at one end of it, and a very extreme example of misogynistic or even misanthropic behavior. But then on the most benign end of it, you also have Laura's boyfriend, who is kind of minimizing her fears that the guy on the stage is someone I knew, and I think that person killed my friend. And he's just like, hey, cool it down. Like, don't you think like the show would have vetted him? And he's really kind of minimizing and reducing her feelings and her opinions, in a way that is destructive and dangerous. And in between there, you have the neighbor and you have the game show host, and you have all these people who are meant to represent different aspects of misogynistic behavior. And the way that each one sort of ties into another or enables another, I think is the thing that I find most interesting, and it's also the thing that I think, because I think most audiences well, no one's going to watch the movie and be like, no one's going to look at Rodney and be like, oh yeah, I see myself in him. Like, oh, I better stop killing people, but I think some people may look at it and be like, well, I have done that. I've minimized, stories that a friend has told me, or I've, whatever. And so I do think the movie should serve some social function where it's just like, how can we do better as men in particular, but just as people and as a culture? And it's not going to be able to do that if your only sort of target is the worst representative.
Something you said there actually reminded me of a conversation I was listening to recently between Sean Fennessy, the host of the Big Picture podcast, and Oz Perkins, who obviously is the writer-director of one of the films of the year in Longlegs. Oz was talking about how his film was sculpted quite carefully around this idea that, films like Silence of the Lambs and Seven, they might be incredible movies, but they do kind of mythologize serial killers in a way that perhaps isn't particularly helpful. I think like across our pop culture in films like that and in shows like, CSI or whatever else, like we often turn serial killers into geniuses who are one step ahead of the law. And there's something kind of borderline admiring about the way that they're presented. Oz talked about how, in fact, in real life, by definition, these guys are completely pathetic. They're losers, to use his phrase. And I think like the phrase that you used there, that they run shallow, kind of chimes with that. The depiction of Rodney in this film is one of a pathetic loser. Like we see him weeping in the dirt. By the end of the film, there's something incredibly pathetic about him. Can you talk to me about the degree to which that depiction was a kind of reaction to the way that serial killers are presented in our media? Maybe it's a reaction to true crime. Like how is the depiction of Rodney here informed by the way that we pedestal serial killers to an unhelpful degree in our culture?
Yeah, no, again, it was a very deliberate choice, and there were sort of two ways of responding to that, which is there's the kind of macro structural architectural depiction of Rodney, um, or to flip it, we tried really hard to make sure that the female characters, and the victims and just whoever encountered them was given roughly an equitable sense of narrative real estate. It's not a 10 episode limited series, it's a movie, so there's only so much to go around. But I wanted to get to know them at least as well as I got to know him, you know? And so some of the way that I tried to answer that concern was, sometimes it's not how you write a character, but like how you write the people around them, and just how much time and space you give to people. And so that was one way of doing it. But yeah, Rodney was in some ways a smart guy, and in some ways he was a charismatic guy. But he also seemed like he had a pretty strong lack of self-awareness, like when he thought he could try his own case, and he brought in some anti-Vietnam song. I'm blanking on what the lyrics were, but like the peak of it all was just like, you have to go out and kill, kill, kill. And he played the song for the jury, thinking that like somehow that would give him sympathy. Like it's just nuts. Like it's like, why did you think this was going to appeal to people? And yet he did. And so, I like the idea of writing him as someone who kind of has a shtick when it comes to seducing people. And he just does the same thing over and over again. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But when it doesn't, as it doesn't with Cheryl towards the end of the movie, when he does the thing where he's just like, oh, you kind of look like this actress and you're so beautiful. And, when he does it with Cheryl, she laughs at him because his comparison is ridiculous, and it seems like he's not thinking very hard about it. He's just on autopilot, and he and she laughs at him, and he suddenly his whole demeanor just kind of curdles. He grows dark and sort of embarrassed and ashamed and defensive. And it's a moment where hopefully we kind of realize, like, oh, he's not a depiction of strength. He's a depiction of a very frail, fragile man who, who's incapable of withstanding like even the most modicum of critique, and so making sure that we carved out moments where we got to see him as not scary, not threatening, but just kind of weird and sad, I thought was important.
This is a film that touches on the idea of media culpability when it comes to creating conditions for misogynists like Rodney, in the fact that, there's a game show and it's run by dismissive producers. That game show is part of a broader misogynist Hollywood culture that we glimpse in that horrible scene where Cheryl is kind of auditioning for something at the beginning of the movie. We can talk about that moment a bit later. How did you navigate the best way to tell this story so that you weren't contributing to that media culture, Ian? Like, it seems, for example, really pointed that the entire movie is from Cheryl's perspective. It's not really about Rodney. He's just adjacent to it. Decisions have also clearly been made about how much or how little of the actual violence that Rodney inflicts on people, how much of that to show. So yeah, talk to me about those decisions and how rooted they were in not wanting to add to media culpability when it comes to encouraging or glamorizing violence against women.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, that was the hardest part of it, and it was the thing that I was the most anxious about. I have strong feelings about violence in films, which isn't to say that it's all bad. I just sort of think like the more visually violent and the more upsetting a movie becomes, the higher the responsibility to use what you're putting the audience through to say something meaningful, and that's not always the case. Evil Dead 2 is basically a big cartoon, and that's fine, and they don't really need to justify anything. But every so often I'll see a movie where it's just, you are just putting the audience through like a really grueling experience, and I kind of leave it going, and what was that all for? Why? Because, if there was a purpose to it all, if you're watching a film like Come and See, like, okay, like there's a point to that, and I'm willing to suffer through it because I feel like, it's using the experience to teach me something or to ask questions that are meaningful for me to wrestle with. Um, and so, but yeah, going back to the initial question, I mean, it was something I obsessed over, where anytime there was a moment of violence on screen, you're always asking yourself, okay, why is this there? And because it exists on a dial is the other thing. It's not an on-off switch. If you make it a little too dark, you run the risk of the film feeling oppressive and gratuitous, in which case the audience is going to get an icky feeling, not icky because of Rodney, but icky because of the filmmakers. And obviously, we don't want that. And yet, if you dial it too far back in the other direction, you run the risk of whitewashing the crimes, and making people go, "Oh, well, it wasn't that bad," or like, I mean, I sometimes am flabbergasted at like the action movies where it's just like you can show 250 guys being gunned down with machine guns, but there's no blood, so it's fine. It's either a PG-13 or a light R movie, and somehow that's okay. Um, and that sort of stuff tends to bum me out. And so at that point, you're really relying on your collaborators to kind of help you find that spot, and that can be producers, it can be other directors, or, other screenwriters who are friends who are just like, yeah, you went a little too far here or not quite far enough there, and at a certain point, you're just kind of feeling your way through and hoping for the best, because there's not really a clear guide on it. Uh, and you just kind of have to trust your instincts. Sorry, did that answer that, or did I step it?
No, that was perfect. This is the second film this year, Ian, that I've loved that happens to use a 1970s TV show as its backdrop. So, this movie and Late Night with the Devil by Colin and Cameron Cairns, both of these films mine the tension and the contrasts between what is happening when the cameras are rolling versus what's happening when they're not. And I'm curious, like, when I find myself engrossed by these types of films that use that setup, what broadly do you think it is about that backdrop that is so kind of dramatically rich?
I mean, I can only speak for myself here. I think I don't know. There's something about that particular time period in the 70s that feels I find it very nostalgic and warm and comforting, which makes for an interesting counterpoint with what the story's actually about, whether or not like it's a serial killer or like a demonic possession, you know. Because you know, you just look at the colors. There's a lot of yellows and oranges and kind of rust red and brown, and it evokes like the foliage in the fall, and there's something very kind of comforting about the shag carpets and the wood paneling walls. I don't know. There's like the time period feels um yeah, just kind of warm and lovely. And in the game show, similarly, there was something kind of lovingly cheesy about them. They tended to be very uh I don't know. There was a lack of cynicism to them and a kind of earnestness that I think we don't really see a lot anymore, and so can't help but find charming. Um, and so I just kind of like living in that world. Like, if I'm ever having like a bad day, like my go-to is to watch like an old 70s horror movie. I don't know. So I guess to me the answer is aesthetic more than anything else.
And after spending a lot of time thinking about the format of a dating show, did you come to any conclusions about the strangeness that they represent? Because it's not like the show in the film is completely extinct. Like, the dating game itself might feel like a relic, but really, dating shows still exist and they're still a huge part of our culture. They've just evolved into programs like Love Island. Did you come to any new conclusions about like the anthropological meaning of these types of shows?
Yeah, well, I mean, oh God, I spent weeks just watching every old episode of the dating game that I could find, which was grueling, by the way. Like reading about the killings is grueling, but this was grueling in a different kind of way because, you're watching very normal, ordinary people try to be clever on national television, and like that seems like hell to me. Like I can't imagine, because that is what they used to do in the dating game, by the way. They would from time to time just be like, "Oh, we're missing a bachelor," and then send a PA out to Sunset Boulevard and say, "Just find someone, just grab someone." And they would run up to some random person on the sidewalk and say, like, "Do you have an hour? Do you want to be on TV? Come with me." You know? And so I don't know. Like my big takeaway when I watch this is that, you know, I'm kind of in love with the awkwardness of them. I find almost nothing in the world more painful than a bad wedding speech. It's just a knife in my heart. And it's that, but in the form of like trying to pick up a date. In terms of like the larger societal implications of them, I don't know. I guess I don't tend to take them too seriously. It's I don't think they're inherently or fundamentally immoral. I think the problem that they run into is when you take two strangers who haven't been vetted and they win and you send them away to Mexico for a weekend or something like that. Like that seems wrong. Like you should probably make sure that the two people you're sending off are like good people to the extent that you can actually figure that out. And like granted that was a lot harder in 1978 where like police departments and different county lines, had a difficult time sharing information and stuff like that. But like Rodney had been arrested twice by the time he was on the dating game. Like that would have been the easiest thing in the world to find out. And so like that seems like a pretty gratuitous oversight. But yeah, I don't know. In general, I mostly find the shows like kind of awkward and off-putting in just like a social way.
You mentioned there how Rodney had been arrested twice before coming on the show. The film doesn't really speculate on his reasons for doing such a mad thing, Ian. What is your guess, if you have one, if it even really matters, why, during the middle of a killing spree, when Rodney should have, by all accounts, been trying to keep a low profile, why he would have paraded himself so publicly? Was that part of the perverse thrill for him, do you think?
Um, I thought of Rodney's narrative as basically being an addiction narrative. Towards the end of the movie, you mentioned it earlier, there's a scene where you find him laying down in the dirt crying, and like, there's a temptation to look at that and be like, oh, he feels bad about what he did, or, and I don't think that's the case. I think he feels bad for himself, because I think he knows that he's putting himself at risk at that point in the narrative in 1979. The police were looking at him. They thought he might have killed these other people in Los Angeles. Um, and and you're right. You're exactly right. That is a time when he should have been, kind of keeping a low profile and being a little quieter. And he did the exact opposite. And it points to a just kind of inherent recklessness. But it also points to I don't want to say entitlement. That's the wrong word. Like he knew he could be caught because he had been caught before. And yet each time he had been caught, the first time I think he had been sentenced to like 15 or 20 years in prison and he got out in 3. And the next time he was supposed to, go in jail for like, again, many years and he got out in a few months. And so like the consequences were always pretty small, were always pretty minor. And so I have to assume that like he didn't think the risks were that substantial. But I also think to a certain degree, he maybe was having a harder time controlling himself towards the end. Like, at one point the police came and knocked on his door and said, like, we need to ask you some questions. And he went out and he killed somebody else like 2 days after that. Or maybe it was even later that night. It was like very, very fast. And it's just like, what are you thinking? Like they are looking at you now. Um, and so, and I also think that this, from what I've read, tends to be like kind of a reoccurring thing with serial killers. In their early years, they kill a person a year or every 2 years, or, and then as they go on and maybe get a little better at what they do, it suddenly is like 3 or 4 people in a year. And then, and it becomes more and more and more. And they just seem to have a hard time stopping themselves. Um, or maybe it's some, it exists in a gray zone between can't control myself and also don't want to because I think I'm good at it, like that, like somewhere between there. So that's kind of my guess.
We should talk about the first draft, Ian. I'm aware that, like, at various points, the film was simply called Rodney and Cheryl. In fact, when it was on the blacklist in 2017, that was the title. There's something really evocative about the name the film ended up going with because, well, Woman of the Hour, it first and foremost sounds like it could be a game show title. And secondly, I think most importantly, it also kind of hints at the enormity of the epidemic of violence against women because, it does seem like in real life, every hour there's another story of a woman abused, a woman murdered in our news cycle. Can you talk to me about the title, its meanings, and at what point it changed?
Yeah, so the original title was well, I guess I'll start with the second one. The second one really wasn't my choice. That was something that was picked by the distributor, and I think Anna had some say in it too. And I like it for all the reasons you mentioned. I think it's a really good one. Initially I had liked the idea of doing a title that had, again, a sort of 70s vibe to it, and the, Bob and Carol, Ted and Alice kind of thing, or Harold and Maude. I like those namey titles, but I also liked one of my big concerns in the earliest draft was that it would just turn into a movie about Rodney Alcala. And my hope was that by putting Cheryl in the title, it would lend the movie a kind of equity. The original title of Boyhood was 12 Years. And when you watch the movie thinking of it as 12 years, you kind of go, oh, it's about everyone. But then when you watch it thinking Boyhood, you go, oh, it's about him. And so a title can really kind of frame the way you receive a movie. And so the intention with the original title was just to make sure that that Cheryl wasn't kind of like lost in the shuffle. But I mean that didn't really happen anyways. So but no, I like the new title, so I'm happy with it.
And what else changed from that first draft besides the title, Ian? Like, was your first pass at the story vastly different, or were the main elements kind of always in place?
So structurally, it was the same. It always had the kind of nonlinear approach. It always alternated between basically being Cheryl's story, and then flashing back to Rodney's past throughout the movie, and during those flashbacks, getting to know the women that he was encountering. And so that was always a big part of it. Um, the thing that changed the most was, because Rodney was so prolific, there's like a lot of stories to pull from, and trying to figure out which of those stories served the larger narrative the best. So for instance, Rodney was a pedophile and he preyed on children. And so like there was a draft that had like him attacking a 12-year-old girl, and the idea with that was just like, if we don't address this, are we whitewashing his crimes to some degree? Are we underplaying just how dark he could go? And we ended up coming to the conclusion that like, yes, that was something he did, and no, we're not trying to whitewash it. But on some level, it feels a little bit adjacent to the concerns of the movie, which, you know, is about the danger that comes with intimacy, and in particular, chosen intimacy, like, oh, I'm going to go on a date with this person, or, and that's really only something that can be established between adults. Rodney pulling up beside some kid getting out of school and saying, like, hey, your parents told me to drive you home. Like, he's just tricked a person, and he tricked everyone. He tricked a lot of people, but it just felt a little bit different. And so like that was a thing that, we would put in and then take out. And then, other changes were just kind of had to do with, budgetary concerns, like there were early drafts that had where you got to see, Rodney was kind of very present in the kind of club scene in Los Angeles in the 70s. And so like showing him like at clubs, dancing with people, schmoozing with people, that was part of it. But and in that way, there was a point at which the movie had like almost a slightly Boogie Nights vibe to it. On one hand, there was the practical concern, which is just that's very expensive to shoot. But on the other hand, that's actually feels kind of like the antithesis of intimacy. It's not two people alone in a space. It's 500 people on a crowded floor trying to scream at each other above the music. And so a lot of the changes were all about kind of making the movie feel more intimate, making it feel more private and small and quiet. And I mean, one of the big changes that came was a note of Anna's, which was great. I didn't realize it when she had signed on, but she's a very big true crime fan, and she knew the case very well. And in an early draft of the script, the girl who's the hitchhiker in the movie, when I had written that in that section into the script initially, in the earliest draft, Rodney picks her up. He drives her to a secluded place. It looks like he's going to attack her, but then he kind of changes his mind and he ends up letting her go, only to then reappear towards the end of the movie and kill her then. And basically, I had written it that way because of the thing that we were talking about earlier, where it's trying to find the right level of darkness in the movie. My initial thought was just like, oh my God, we've just seen, you know, 4 or 5 women get like raped and killed. Like, do we really need to see another one? Like, and yet at the same time, I knew that the story was kind of important for the narrative. And so I had kind of softened it. And Anna read the script and she's just like, yeah, but the problem with softening it is if you don't see her get attacked, you don't get to see her be clever after she wakes up. And we need to see her be clever because that's the most interesting part of the story. And so, she was right. And in that way, the movie became tougher and more grounded in the facts. And, and I think the ending's all the better because of it.
I'm really fascinated in how you worked with Anna to kind of incorporate into the screenplay these horrifying autobiographical experiences that she had underwent that that spoke to the themes of the film. There's a moment, for example, where Cheryl is auditioning for a role and she says that she doesn't want to do nudity, and the casting guy replies, "Oh honey, I'm sure they're fine," referring to her breasts, which is horrifying. That is something that actually happened to Anna in real life, she's explained. Can you talk to me about like working her experiences into the script, like what your conversations were there that enabled that?
So a lot of the revisions that I did for her were kind of about were like really micro things that were in service of making the film reflect her emotional experiences with things like this. Going back to the scene with Amy in the car with Rodney, again in an earlier draft, she was like very kind of tough and assertive and calling him out on his creepiness. And it was funny because Anna called me up and she's just like, "Look, I love this character and I love what you're trying to do. And I like that you're writing like um, this woman with a lot of agency, but you have to give her less agency, which is a very weird note for a male screenwriter to get about their female character. But the point that she was making is like, hey, look, if I'm alone with a guy in the middle of a desert, I'm not going to be mouthing off to him. I'm going to be really polite and really sweet, and I'm not going to hurt his feelings. And that's just kind of the game that we as women have to play, you know. And uh, and by doing that, I by kind of adjusting to that, I've made the film kind of reflect her experiences more, but it also just feels like a more realistically written scene, because she's right. And I think this is one of the things that is, for me, one of the most interesting parts of being and one of the most important parts of being a good screenwriter is being a good listener, because we're writing all these different characters from all these different backgrounds, and you know and I'm kind of the opinion that anybody should be allowed to write about anybody. There shouldn't be any inherent limitations. um, However, if you get it wrong, that's a problem and you should be taken to task for that. And so if you want to get it right, it means you have to listen to people, and you have to not just listen, but you have to solicit opinions and experiences from people who represent the demographic that you're writing about, and sometimes that's just reaching out to friends. I reached out to a lot of friends who are actresses and said, tell me about your experiences um, uh, in callbacks. What's it been like? What's the fun side of it? What's the demeaning side of it? How bad has it gotten? Et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes it's listening to your director who's just like, oh, I've been through this. Let me tell you how it went for me, you know? And yeah, so I mean, I don't know. I think listening is a huge part of the job.
I suppose it's by listening that you're able to write with such authenticity. Moments like the one where Cheryl's out with her neighbor. You kind of mentioned there the need for women to appease these men, to stroke their egos in order to keep themselves safe. There's this moment in the film where, Cheryl is out for a drink that she doesn't want to be having with this neighbor, and he reaches over and he sort of brushes her hair back behind her ear in this romantic way. That's his intention. It's a moment that is massively overstepping the mark, and in that moment, she can't lash out and say, "What are you doing?" You can see the cogs turning in her brain, and she clearly works out that the way to appease him, to not wound him, is to kind of to keep herself safe. She has to kind of navigate that in a particular way, because she doesn't know what that guy's capable of if she outright rejects him. These small moments of threat, like the everyday moments of women having to navigate potential male violence and be kind of hyper vigilant of the prospect of that. Did you solicit advice and the real life stories of female friends for those? How did you bring that together so authentically on the page?
Yeah, so again, a lot of that was Anna. I think it's pretty publicly known at this point that Chloe Okuno was attached to direct before Anna. And she and I worked on the script together for years, and so that scene in particular, I remember she had a lot of really useful notes and thoughts about like how to make that land. And so yeah, I mean, it was mostly those scenes. I think were mostly with collaborators. But also, I mean, my wife is a writer and director, and generally how it works is anytime I write a new script, she generally reads the first three drafts before I share it with anyone else. And and so she's kind of like a really important creative collaborator and filter for me and yeah, she would also read draft after draft after draft and go like, I think you're a little off here, and help me get closer to something that felt authentic.
Was that your process of finding the kind of little moments of sisterhood in the film as well? Because, there are all these great and really revealing moments in which, like, within that context of women always having to kind of safely eject themselves from situations instead of outwardly telling someone, you were making me feel unsafe, you have all these flashpoints where, like when the waitress refuses to order them another round at the bar because she's picking up on Cheryl's signal that I don't want to have another drink with this person. You have all these moments where other women are coming to Cheryl's rescue because they've been in that situation themselves, clearly. Talk to me about that thread of the film, because there's quite a few moments like that.
Yeah, no, so the waitress definitely came from those conversations and that also just came from like reading articles online about like if you're a woman at a bar and there's like a weird guy hitting on you, like, what special drink do you tell the bartender you want that is going to signal him to help get you out of trouble, and so yeah, a lot of it was again just conversations and soliciting stories from people that I knew and trusted. There were other things that came pretty naturally and were there all along. So, the stuff with like the hair and makeup women on the show is another sort of, I think, arc of sisterhood in it that I'm really proud of, and I really like those moments. It actually has one of my favorite lines in the movie where, the makeup woman says like, "Oh, you're just asking the same thing that everybody else is asking. You're just doing it in a different way, and the question is like, which one of you is going to hurt me?" And like that's a line that was there from the very beginning, and so there were elements of it that uh, that had always been part of it. And so, but that right there is like an idea. Like that line represents an idea, and I think it's a truthful idea. I think the stuff where it became the most necessary to reach out to friends and collaborators for help and refining is more behavioral stuff, Um, I'm 6'1", I'm 200 pounds. Like, I've definitely been in like weird, uncomfortable situations with people before, but it's not the same, and so that is a point when you want to make sure, again, to make sure you're getting it right, you just want to talk to people who have been there. And in some ways, it's no different than writing any other, if you're writing a movie about astronauts, well, you better talk to some astronauts and see what it's like, because I'm not an astronaut. If you want to know what it's like to be a 25-year-old woman going on a date with a guy you don't trust, like, well, I haven't done that, so I'm going to reach out to people who have.
You talked earlier about how there wasn't really much of Cheryl herself out there in the public domain in terms of the real Cheryl, and that left you this space for you to kind of go in and fictionalize things. I'm really curious as to like what was fictionalized, both when it came to Cheryl and the wider film at large. There's a woman, for example, in this story who is in the audience at the game show, and she recognizes Rodney, and she tries to flag to the producers that this guy is potentially dangerous, only to be really cruelly dismissed. They fob her off onto a janitor. That is a really fascinating side plot in the film. It's a very revealing side plot. Even her partner refuses to believe her when she's sounding these alarm bells. It all speaks to one of the themes of the film, this idea that kind of men's default mode is one of denial when it comes to assault and violence against women. And that is another enabling force in the culture that creates people like Rodney. Was that woman someone who existed, or were they completely made up, Ian? Talk to me about like what was fabricated versus what really happened, who was really there in this film versus reality.
Yeah, so let me answer that in a slight roundabout way. When Anna and I first met, we had a really long conversation about not just what we wanted to fictionalize, but we wanted to have a kind of um, a philosophy behind why we were fictionalizing certain things. And we talked about this book called The Things They Carried. It's a famous Vietnam book by an author named Tim O'Brien, and he has this chapter in the book where he talks about, the difference between real war stories and uh, real and fake war stories. And he starts out by telling the story about a group of soldiers who are kind of trekking through the jungle, and suddenly a hand grenade gets thrown into their midst, and one heroic soldier throws himself on top of the hand grenade, and it blows up, and it kills him, but it saves everybody else around him. And he's like, "Look, I've heard this story enough times to know that it happened. Like, this is a thing that happened." He goes, "The problem is that's not what it was like to be in Vietnam. Like that, like emotionally, that was not my experience." And he's like, "Here's a story that didn't happen." And it's a group of soldiers who are traveling through the jungle. A hand grenade gets thrown into their midst, and this one soldier throws himself on top of it. The hand grenade goes off, it kills him, and it kills everybody else around him. And as they're all laying on the ground, holding in their guts and bleeding to death, one of them turns to the heroic guy and says, like, "What were you thinking? Why on earth would you do that?" And he's just like, "I don't know, man. I meant well." And then they all die. And he's like, "That never happened, but that's what it felt like to be there." And so whenever we would fictionalize something, it was with the intention of serving a larger emotional truth. So the character that you mentioned, Laura, I read a number of stories about the friends of victims and the families of victims, and that gutting, awful feeling of getting a call from the police and saying, "We need you to come identify a body," or having to go over to your friend or your sister's apartment after the body's been removed, but you have to clean all the stuff out because somebody's got to clean all the stuff out. And you show up there and there's still this mattress sitting there that's been stripped, and there's like a blood stain that just covers the entire thing, and how gutting that is. And the experience of people who are just like, "Oh, I was at a bar and I saw my friend talking to this guy and he felt sort of creepy, but I didn't say anything because I didn't think it was my place to say anything. And then I never saw her again." And I would talk to the police and say, "I think it's this guy." And they're just like, "No, we talked to him and he checks out. He's okay. He's got an alibi, you know?" And so there were all these stories about people kind of who weren't the victim, but who were adjacent to the victim. And it just felt like that belonged in there somewhere. And there wasn't really, and so this character, Laura, to us felt like the kind of elegant way to include her. And it does sort of, the character's meant to sort of do two things at once, which is, on one hand, she's meant to kind of represent that perspective and kind of broaden the themes of the film. But also, the film is a thriller on some level, and the thriller aspect is kind of the sugar that helps the medicine go down. You want to keep the audience engaged, because that's the thing that's going to allow them to engage with these larger themes. And so, and so the reason we included her in the way we did was to serve both of those functions.
You mentioned there being sugar to help the medicine go down in the construction of this film. I think that's true. Like on top of all the salient points about abuse that the film makes, it kind of is, well, it's weird to say, but it is like a fun spectacle as well. It's like an engaging spectacle as a piece of entertainment. Like, it works as a great character piece too. We come to care about Cheryl, and we're able to celebrate by the end of the film the inner change that she kind of is able to achieve because of the external experience of coming into the orbit of this killer. Like, by the end of the film, she has much better guardrails about saying no to people and how she's going to reject people who make her feel unsafe. What can you tell me, Ian, about constructing that journey for her, and what you elected to put in the film because you had that space to fictionalize things about the character versus what actually happened to her and the things of her true experience that you wanted to honor in this screenplay?
So there's a lot of different ways to answer that. There's the kind of like little micro elements that cumulatively form her narrative arc, so like you said before, the movie begins with a very awkward scene between her and her neighbor where she kind of knows what she wants and what she doesn't want, and she's getting a bad vibe about this guy, and she doesn't trust her gut, or at least it's not that she doesn't trust it, she neglects her feelings. She back burners her feelings for his feelings. And, you know, by kind of going about that in the wrong way, that teaches her how to do it in the right way. And then by the end of the film, she's trusting her gut and she's acting on her impulses and she's doing the things she knows she needs to do to keep her safe. And so, those are things, the thing with the neighbor, I have no proof that that exact thing happened to this woman, which is again why I consider this character to be just a creation. But it's a creation that that serves the larger story and the larger themes and the ideas. And yeah, and again, the goal was always just like all the little details that are included are writing a screenplay in a weird way is more like writing a haiku than writing a novel. Like every word matters, every line of dialogue, every prop has to serve more than one function. Nothing can do one thing, everything has to do two things. And so the fact that she's an actor, that ties into the fact that she's, okay, who's this person that's struggling in Hollywood? Well, this is most of us out here are dreamers in one way or another. But it also ties into this idea of being looked at. What is it what does it mean to be looked at in a good way versus a bad way? And how does that feed into the experience that she undergoes on the TV show itself? And so, it's tricky because, at the end of the day, it's a very precise and exacting art form, but it's still an art form. And so, it's not a math formula. A lot of these things you're kind of feeling your way through. But you want to make sure that the things that are kind of checking these emotional boxes all kind of tie together somehow. They all connect, and that they feel cumulative and not reiterative. You don't want two scenes that are doing the exact same thing. So hopefully each time we flash back to Rodney and show some new encounter with some new person, it's telling us something a little bit different about him. And in so doing, digging just a little bit deeper, not only into him as a character, but into the larger situation.
We should talk about the ending, Ian, because there's a really interesting tone to it. Like, I suppose there is some kind of quote unquote triumph in that we see the killer apprehended. There's a resolution in that sense, but of course, the culture that enables someone like that is still in place at the end of the film. The problem that Rodney is an extreme byproduct of still remains. So there's kind of this bittersweet tone. Can you tell me about putting this ending together and what thoughts or feelings you wanted it to leave the audience with?
Yeah, so I mean, the real goal is always that just the movie feel honest, that it feel truthful. And sometimes happy endings are the most honest ending, and sometimes they're not. And while yes, there is the kind of momentary triumph of like Rodney's arrested, there's a title card that pops up immediately following the movie that reveals like, oh, he went to jail and then he was immediately put out on bail and then he killed three more women. Like, and so it's a triumph that is very short-lived, and is followed by a gut punch because that's how that story should feel. I mean, it's funny. I've always been really fascinated with like feel bad cinema. Whether it's like, No Country for Old Men or Come and See or, Wendy and Lucy. Like, these are some of my favorite movies. And they're movies that they can be this the subject matter can be really depressing, but the experience of watching them isn't depressing to me. It feels at times almost cleansing. And I think the reason for that is because they feel honest. They reflect some experience or worldview that when you see it on screen feels validating, you know? Um, it's just that very old kind of like, oh, I'm not alone in the world. Somebody else has felt this too. And so I think that's always kind of the emotional bullseye that you're trying to hit at the end of a movie. And the fact of the matter is like, yeah, eventually they did catch him and he did die in prison. But before that happened, a lot of people died. And it was only the third time or the fourth time he was arrested that it kind of stuck. And so there is no happy ending tied to his story that's actually happy. It's just various degrees of sad. The other thing that sort of goes with that is like by kind of uncovering people like Rodney, we are collectively learning how to spot them better. And we're learning how to, I don't know, refine our social expectations in a way that hopefully makes so that there's not more people like him. And so that is a thing to be celebrated, And so Cheryl's kind of like rejecting of the culture that had bred him is a kind of like slight upside to the end of the movie. And so, and I think that's where, the sweet part of the bittersweet comes in. It hopefully shouldn't be all one thing. It should be multiple feelings. And as a viewer, I like sitting in that kind of weird, uncomfortable place where I'm just like, I'm kind of happy, I'm kind of sad. I don't quite know. What is it? The great American playwright Thornton Wilder said, all the great art gives the audience a job to do. And I think those kind of audience is part of the job of the audience. Okay, now figure out how you feel about this, and yeah. So that's kind of my takeaway on the ending.
Yeah, that's really interesting about audiences working through how the film made them feel. I'm especially curious about like the male response to the film because like I feel like it is designed to alert men that like it's not enough to just not be Rodney, to not be a serial killer. Like if you're not outright refusing the system that creates people like him, if you're not working to bring it down, then you're kind of participating in it and therefore enabling it further. That's a really interesting element to this movie. And I wonder what reflection it might cause in the men who see this movie.
Yeah, no, and I hope that is the takeaway. And that by the way was also part of the reason why we made sure to include, a kind of prospective male victim in the movie because like I think so often like we're very used to seeing women victimized and not just victimized but kind of leered at in this very particular way in these sorts of movies. It's a little more unusual to see men kind of victimized in this way. And, and for that reason, I hope that male viewers will feel a different kind of discomfort, something that's maybe a little more unfamiliar, and maybe even more potent because of that. And hopefully that engenders a deeper level of empathy, for all the victims collectively, because there's a sense of like, oh, that's what that's like.
Absolutely. Well, Ian, thank you so much for this movie and thanks for the conversation today. I've got to let you go, we're out of time, but this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on Script Apart.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This was such a pleasure.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.